Hello, YouTube. This is David on behalf of Godsman00, also known as DC7845. I am here by suggestion to research and discuss the complete history of the Vanguard TCG. If you're new to the game, you question the significance of the encounter cards, or you're a veteran looking to reminisce about the way it used to be, or you're a longtime anime watcher and you just want to see all the nostalgic cards, then you're in the right place. Today, we're just going to start out this series by discussing the very first core booster set ever released, Booster Set 1, Descent of the King of Knights. A couple different things that we should kind of cover before we start is that, one, if you've only been playing since Overdress started in 2021, then I must remind you that the game was originally designed around clans instead of nations. Sounds like a weird thing to say now, but I feel like that's necessary to say at this point. If you need a full explanation of clans, just feel free to let us know and we'll be able to help you out there. Another thing to note is that clan regulations did not exist during this time period. And these are the rules that prohibit the mixing of units from different clans in deck building, with a few exceptions. This ruling didn't exist until G-Era, which began at about December of 2014 in Japan, March 2015 for English. So that means that the cards and effects might be weirdly designed, or they just have text on them that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense otherwise. So with that in mind, we're going to kind of jump right in. The Booster Set 1, Descent of the King of Knights, was released on March 12th, 2011 in Japan, and December 10th, 2011 in English. It was about a 9-month gap back then, so kind of a long-ish gap. If that makes you feel any better about what the current gap is between Japan and English. The set contained a total of 80 cards, and if you aren't too terribly familiar with the time period, there was actually a total of 10 different clans supported in this set, but the distribution of cards to those 10 clans was a little bit odd. For instance, there was 15 different cards given to Royals and Kagaguru. Some of these were reprints from the trial decks, while 13 cards of support were given to Oracle Think Tank and Nova Grappler. Meanwhile, Tachikaze, Nubatama, Dark Irregulars, Spike Brothers, Grand Blue, and Mega Colony would all only receive 4 cards of support. If you played during V, that's not going to make a whole lot of sense. What you were probably used to, and what you're probably used to with Nations now, is decks just come fully completed, and back then that wasn't really the case. These 6 clans were not completed, they didn't have trigger lineups, they didn't have perfect guards, etc. They were meant to just be mixed with the already completed clans. And this is kind of a little bit of a different take on what might have been viewed as a bad design strategy by the Cardfight Vanguard team back then, but I think this was actually a fairly good idea, because instead of just giving 4 completed clans, they gave 4 completed clans and some extras that you could mix in with your deck if you preferred that kind of aesthetic or playstyle. Now, of course, there's a lot of drawbacks to this. Despite the non-existence of clan regulations, it's actually really hard to mix clans. And this was mainly because a lot of the stronger units in each clan were generally very restricted to their clan. For instance, Alfred only gained power from other Royal Paladin rearguards and could only call Royal Paladin rearguards from the deck. So a lot of his abilities were locked behind playing like a full deck of Royal Paladins. So it's kind of hard to mix clans, and it was worse. It was a little bit worse due to the triggers there was a ruling regarding triggers stating that if you didn't have a unit with the same clan as the trigger that was checked, you couldn't actually activate the effect of that trigger. So you basically, if you were playing Kagaguru triggers, you had to have Kagaguru units on the board. So that just made it a little bit more complicated when deck building. So actually, a lot of the time, you didn't see a whole lot of mixing. Sometimes it came up and it was really, really good or janky, but a lot of the time it wasn't very frequently used. Now, this set mainly focuses on the 4 major Q4 clans, which is Royal Paladins, Kagaguru, Oracle Think Tank, and Nova Grappler. Obviously, following along with the anime, these were the kind of the cards featured in the first 13 episodes of the original anime. The cover card of the set was, of course, the King of Knights Alfred from the Royal Paladin clan, and as one would expect from the very first set, it was pretty impactful for the game's first year of play, and had a lot of iconic and powerful cards. Some other interesting trivia about this set was that most of the uncompleted clans would receive full waves of support in the next couple of sets, with the exception of Nubatama. Strange fact about Nubatama was that they received 4 cards of support here in set 1, but they wouldn't receive any other support until set 13, Catastrophic Outbreak, on September 13th of 2013. That was about 2.5 years after its initial release. Another mildly interesting fact was that Nova Grappler, despite being a completed clan alongside Oracle Think Tank, Royals, and Kagaguru, for some reason didn't receive its perfect guard in set 1. I have no idea why it was excluded. You would get it in set 2, being Twin Blader, but for some reason it was missing from the first set. So of the 4 completed clans at that point, one of them just didn't have a perfect guard. It was the only time you'd ever see a clan completed without a perfect guard. So some of that actually makes you question whether or not the initial intention was for every clan to have a perfect guard, but obviously we know that every clan would eventually get one now. Now, as for the new mechanics that were released in this set, of course, Vanguard will receive a lot of different mechanics and archetypes over its history, and this set was no exception. To begin, we should probably mention Ultimate Blast. Ultimate Blast was one of the it was a strange mechanic. Had a very powerful skill, oftentimes locked behind an really insane cost. For some clans, it was a little easier to achieve than others, but for the most part, it was a pretty unachievable condition. Counterblast 5 and Soul Blast 8. These weren't really all that played for the Ultimate Blast skill themselves, because honestly, Counterblast 5 and Soul Blast 8 was borderline impossible to do, as it was very easy to see it coming and pretty easy to deny on the opponent's side. But they did have a few other uses. Almost all of them had an effect that allowed you to soul charge and then get an additional effect. This was to help fuel the Soul Blast 8 cost of the Ultimate Blast, but oftentimes this was an additional effect that the Ultimate Blast unit was played for. The most iconic of these was CEO Amaterasu. CEO Amaterasu was a card that allowed you to soul charge at the beginning of the main phase, then check the top card of the deck and either put it on the top or the bottom of the deck. This was, of course, pretty good skill for Oracle Think Tank, a deck well known for stacking the top card of their deck. Another one that was incredibly interesting at this time was Mr. Invincible, which allowed you to soul charge and counter charge, which, funny enough, it's all play in janky decks that really needed counter charge, because they play rear guards with heavy counterblast effects. This was actually one of the few units that would see play mixed into other clans, as like you would ride this, and for instance, you would call a rear guard like Dragonic Overlord, and you would use his Counterblast 3 skill to attack the front row, while Mr. Invincible would give you counter charge to kind of get those resources back. It was an interesting card. It saw a lot of play in a lot of jank decks, but other than that, like, this is kind of like the two more iconic if you will, Ultimate Blast from this set. Now, again, they were really, really powerful, but they were very, very flawed in their Ultimate Blast cost. It was just super easy to deny. But sometimes that soul charge was actually part of the reason that it was used for. For instance, King of Demonic Seas Baskirk would actually not really care about the bonus effect that he got from his soul charge. He just wanted the soul charge so that you could abuse Dancing Cutlass, which was one of the very few cards that allowed you to plus back in the original days of Grand Blue. Amaterasu would obviously do this for Luckbird as well. And that's kind of all I've got to say about Ultimate Blast. It wasn't a super great mechanic, and really nobody used it for what it was actually meant to be used for. It was just a way to get free resources normally. The next thing we should talk about is an archetype of grade 3 boss units that all shared a very similar skill. These grade 3 boss units generally get an additional effect when you drive check a grade 3 while they're on the Vanguard circle. And generally these were just like bonus effects. You didn't really want to build your deck around it just because the consistency of drive checking grade 3s was not the best, but if they were nice bonuses, then it was actually well worth it. One in particular that saw a lot of play was Dragon Monk Goku. Dragon Monk Goku is a very, very simple skill that says when you drive check a grade 3, you get to retire a grade 1 or lower rear guard. And this was just a very easy bonus effect that Kagaguru could well utilize, since Dragonic Overlord, their other big bad boss unit, could function on rearguard circle. Then there was a couple like poor examples of this, such as Crimson Butterfly Bridget, which came from the Royal Paladin trial deck. It only gained 5k, that's not really worth it. Ashura Kaiser was a really powerful unit, but it kind of felt like you had to build the deck around him, which of course led to inconsistencies with him not checking a grade 3 when you needed him to check a grade 3. Yeah, that's kind of it. They were good cards for the time, as they were often free effects, and that is really nice. But there's some consistency issues there, and they would eventually rotate out of the format as we got stronger boss units. The next ability that we can kind of talk about, or the next skill that we can talk about, would be the Forerunner ability. Yes, the Forerunner ability was introduced at the very beginning of this game. Through the first 4 cards that had the Forerunner ability, being Lozenge Magus, Battle Riser, Bartgall, and Lizard Soldier Conroe. 2 of these were obviously incredibly powerful, and 2 of these were incredibly unique, to say the least. So they were grade 0s intended to be played as your starting Vanguard. They all shared a skill that allowed them to be called to rearguard circle when a unit with the same clan name would ride on top of them. Generally, this would allow you to, they would have another skill attached to them that helped with their deck's core mechanic, and they were pretty notorious for being powerful throughout their existence until V-Series removed them entirely. Lizard Soldier Conroe and Bartgall were no exceptions to this. These were definitely the strongest Forerunners released for a very, very long time. Bartgall, notorious enough to be the first card ever restricted on the restriction list. Now, Lozenge Magus and Battle Riser were actually very rare. It was actually incredibly interesting that they put the Forerunner on a trigger effect, and they didn't really replicate this effect too often after. Circle Magus, or Sphere Magus, and Turbo Riser would come out later, and they were essentially just carbon copies of Battle Riser and Lozenge Magus. And then in set 6, we would randomly get Sunny Smile Angel. And then after that, nothing. This was a mechanic that was given to only 5 different units, but then just disappeared. Like, they just forgot that this mechanic existed. But it was a fairly interesting idea, just because it allowed you to, it actually gave you one more spot that you could use for your grade 1, 2, or 3s. And it was obviously a trigger that would just go back into the deck. Not a super strong effect, But it was interesting that they brought it out, they gave it to the game, and then they completely ditched the idea. So next, we'll talk about superior riding, because yes, superior riding, everyone's favorite mechanic in Vanguard, existed as early as the very first set. Now, not nearly as powerful as what you're probably used to in today's game, and I'm not even just referring to Bartgall, who did have a superior ride mechanic, but it didn't function the way that I'm trying to state. Kagaguru actually was the first clan to receive the ability to superior ride up to grade 3 before when you would normally ride up to grade 3. This came in the form of Embodiment of Victory Alif. In order to superior ride Embodiment of Victory on turn 2, you'd need 3 different cards. You would need Embodiment of Spear Tar, Embodiment of Armor Bar, and Dragon Knight Alif, who would need to be your turn 2 ride. You would also need a single counterblast on top of all of that. Admittedly, this was quite piece reliant, which is fair because superior riding up to grade 3 was an incredibly powerful mechanic. But Embodiment of Victory Alif wasn't really a great card. He was a pretty fair card, all things considered, and I personally believe that Lizard Soldier Conroe was actually created with this skill that allowed you to search a grade 1 in order to make this superior ride more consistent. But even with that, it still wasn't that consistent to see 3 different cards in the first 2 turns of the game to allow for this superior ride. They would try the exact same thing again with Blazing Flare in the next set, and that did just about as well as Alif did. Admittedly, some of those cards were actually stronger, but it wasn't a mechanic that really took off. They would refine this in set 6 with Incandescent Lion Blonde Ezel, which they would replicate with Metatron in set 9, and then with Dragonic Descendant in set 10, and those superior ride chains actually saw a lot more success. And that was mostly due to the fact that one of your pieces was your Forerunner, making you only need 2 card combo to do it rather than 3. So yeah, superior ride has been here since the very beginning. No use complaining about it anymore, I hope. But its early iterations were a little bit rough. Now, before we get into the best cards, I do need to mention that there were trial decks released around the time of Booster Set 1. There was 2 different trial decks, one being based around Blaster Blade and one being based around Dragonic Overlord. Of course, they are mirroring the main characters of the first season of the anime, so they would of course be based around these 2 units. Both released on the 26th of February in 2011, a whole 2 weeks prior to the core set's release. Blaster Blade would feature cards of the Royal Paladin clan, and Dragonic Overlord would feature cards from the Kagaguru clan, if you're not familiar. Both included 50 full card decks, with 3 holographic cards per deck. Of course, we're going to go ahead and start with definitely the weaker of these 2, and that's Blaster Blade. Trial Deck 1 Blaster Blade came with 1 whole copy of Blaster Blade, which came as one of the holographic cards in the set, of course. So if you wanted a full playset from the trial deck, you either bought singles or you bought 4 copies of the trial deck, which is great design. They did wonderful there. But they luckily Blaster Blade would be reprinted as a triple rare in the core set, as well as a SP. The triple rare having a alternate art, which is fairly interesting. The trial deck would also include 4 copies of the grade 3 boss unit, Crimson Butterfly Bridget. 2 were released as holos, 2 as non-holos. There's quite a few different exclusive cards from the trial deck that weren't included in the core set, such as Bridget, Knight of Conviction Boars, Knight of Harp Tristan, Knight of Rose Morgana, Starlight Unicorn, Stardust Trumpeter, and Bringer of Good Luck, Epina. Most of these could have also been obtained in a Japanese half deck known as Star Drive deck, which was released on January 21st of 2011, just like a month before these trial decks. But there's not really a whole lot to talk about there. I'm not going to dive too much into it. Just know that these existed beforehand. Not a whole lot going on with this trial deck. Actually, a lot of the cards were not very good in it. And there's really, other than Blaster Blade, and I guess like you wanted your Galatines because it was 10k base, a lot of the cards in the set were actually pretty bad. Trial Deck 2, by comparison, was significantly better. And a lot of people would consider Trial Deck 2 Dragonic Overlord to be one of the best trial decks released in the early years of Vanguard. By contrast, it came with 2 copies of Dragonic Overlord, which is pretty nice. One came as holo, one came as non-holo. It would also include 4 whole copies of Berserk Dragon, a staple card, I might add, in Kagaguru for quite some time, 2 of which would come as holo, 2 of which came as non-holo. This was already a better start, but there's still more to come with it. Some exclusives that came in this trial deck include Demonic Dragon Berserker Yaksha, Demonic Dragon Mage Rakshasa, Dragon Monk Goku, and Lizard Runner Undun. I apologize if I butchered those names, because I very likely did. Very similarly, though, some of these exclusive cards could have been found in the other Japanese half deck, the Crested deck. Dragonic Overlord was just vastly better. It gave you 1 copy of Goku, which was a competitive grade 3 at that time. But coming with 4 copies of Berserk Dragon was already just way better than 1 copy of Blaster Blade. It also gave 2 copies of Gojo, Dragon Monk Gojo, which is the clone of your card that says that when you rest this unit, you can discard and draw a card. That was printed quite a few times on quite a few different units, like Screaming and Dancing Announcer Shout. That's a mouthful. And Lake Mei and Lien. So there was a few different clones of this card, but the Kagura one was released in this trial deck, and it was very, very good in Kagura for a while. Funny enough, getting specific cards into the drop zone was actually pretty good for this clan. But other than that, like, the Blaster Blade trial deck just didn't offer much. Unfortunately, a lot of its clan's main powerful cards would be released as high rarity cards in the core set. Now with the trial decks out of the way and the mechanics from this set, we can get on to the best cards that came out in this set. So when looking at this booster set and looking at the best cards from the set, I'm going to give you a link to see some of the deck lists from the major competitions that were held during the 2011 summer season. It was a Vanguard Fight Championship. It was, just kind of like a tournament circuit, and there was a nationals at the end. So there's actually a couple different, like, a good amount of lists that you can look at if you want to see how people were building decks. Just keep in mind the game was really, really early. People weren't terribly familiar with how to build decks quite yet. So take these lists with a grain of salt. Now, I will mention the national tournament was pretty heavily dominated by Royal Paladins. So if you think there's a lot of Royal Paladins on this list, that's probably why. So to start with one of the best cards, we should definitely start with the cover card of this set. King of Knights Alfred, he lives up to his name. He is the king of this clan, and he would be their main boss for quite a while until set 5. He was a grade 3. He had 3 different skills and a 10,000 power base. Keep in mind that back then 10,000 was a very normal base to have on grade 3 units. There were some that had 9,000 power and others that had 11,000 power. It was kind of all over the place, but 10,000 was pretty normal during this time, if that seems off to you. The first of these skills said that he cannot be boosted. Now, this wasn't too big of an issue because this was offsetted by his second skill that allowed him to get 2,000 power for each of his Royal Paladin rearguards. And then he had a Vanguard or rearguard circle. Kind of interesting that he also worked on rearguard circle that allowed you to counterblast 3, search your deck for a grade 2 or less Royal Paladin, and call it to rearguard, then shuffle your deck. So basically, he kind of just did all of the basics of Vanguard. He would give you a unit to the board, he would gain power, and he would hit hard. He had the fundamentals down. And that's what made him such a good card. Counterblast 3 might sound a little bit like a little bit much, but keep in mind back then, plusing was very, very limited, and counterblast to actually get pluses were actually very high. A lot of counterblast 2, a lot of counterblast 3 skills, and basically no ways to countercharge led to only being able to activate 2 or 3 effects per game. So a little bit interesting. And so you'll see these skills that were completely free, like Barkall, seemed really, really powerful for that time. At this time, this was nothing short of amazing. If you had 5 rearguards attacked for 20,000 power against any 10k base Vanguard, and there were quite a few of them, this was incredibly hard to guard, especially when shield values just weren't that high. There wasn't a whole lot of defensive options outside of PGs. So this was actually just a very, very powerful pressure unit, and definitely one of the better units. And this card would even see play in Majesty Lord Blaster decks later, but we'll get to that eventually. Another Royal Paladin that was incredibly impactful on this format was the first Forerunner for the clan. Barkall was the starter of choice for the clan until he was removed from being able to be as a starter. He had 2 different skills. He, of course, had the Forerunner skill, which wasn't called a Forerunner at the time. It just said that when another Royal Paladin rides this unit, you can call it to rearguard circle. And then he had a Axe skill that allowed you to rest him. And if you do, you can search your deck for a Flogel, or a Future Night Lu. So these 2 were important mainly because of Future Night Lu. Future Night Lu had the skill that allowed you to counterblast 1, put him into the soul alongside Barkall and Flogel, and then you could search your deck for a Blaster Blade and ride it as stand. So this was incredibly good, because one thing that this game was really lacking at this point was consistency in seeing your ride targets, if you will. So one thing you would come across is sometimes you wouldn't have the correct grade to ride up. And back then we didn't have G-Assist, we didn't have a ride deck, so you had to draw into the correct grade to ride up. And if you didn't, you were what we would refer to as grade stuck, which meant that you couldn't ride up, you just had to stay on the grade you're on. This was a pretty big problem at first when decks couldn't plus very well. And the one way to combat this was with, of course, Barkall. But maybe that was a tad too good, because ensuring that you always had a grade 2 to ride was incredibly powerful. And it also happened to give you 3 soul at the same time, which would eventually be good for Soul Saver in the next set. But it was the only clan that had this ability, so it felt like, why play anything else when I can play Royals and never be grade stuck? And that just kind of mindset wasn't really like a healthy way for the game to start out. So Barkall was just a very, very powerful card in that sense, but it also could just call 2 Flogels. And why would you want to call 2 Flogels? Well, turns out Alfred gets 2,000 power for each of his rear guards, so free ways to create board was, just a very good thing for this deck in general. And I mean, 5k boosters, it doesn't make a whole big difference if you have, 10k attackers. So it was just an overall good card. You could use it for either situation. You needed a grade 2 to ride, it's got you. You need to fill your board, it's got you. It does too much, and it's completely free. Eventually, it'd be the first card ever restricted on the restriction list in September of 2011 for Japan. English would follow suit in August of 2012. Coincidentally, for both regions, it was right before the release of Booster Set 3, which had a big wave of Royal Paladin cards. Go figure. Now, we've already talked about Future Knight Lu allowing the superior ride with Flogel, but there was a few other different cards that were really good for Royal Paladins that was released in this set. Lake Main Lien was a perfect unit that you could stick behind Alfred because her skill, you would rest her in order to discard a card and draw a card, very similar to Dragon Monk Gojo. But this was particularly good in Royals because you could stick it behind Alfred, who couldn't be boosted anyways, and just get a free way to discard and draw a card with basically no downside. Blaster Blade was obviously a key card for this clan as well, obviously for the superior ride, but he also had a pretty solid skill that retired rear guards, albeit that skill was a little bit costly because Royals had quite a few different ways they could actually use their counterblast, so it wasn't always best to use his retire skill, and his retire skill only retired grade 2 or higher units anyways, so not always the best, and there wasn't really a good way to unflip that damage anyways. Next, we will talk about Kagaguru. So Kagaguru got quite a few different good cards from this set. Mainly, the first card we have to talk about is Lizard Soldier Conroe. Very impactful Forerunner. This would see play for quite a long time. It also would eventually end up restricted on the restriction list much later, but it had a very powerful skill itself. You could counterblast 1, retire this unit, and then search your deck for a grade 1 or lower Kagaguru unit and add it to your hand, and then shuffle your deck. So it allowed you to search perfect cards, because perfect cards were grade 1s, and that would be its main utility for a long time. This allowed Kagaguru to be a very stable clan to play in tournaments. So you could go multiple rounds in tournaments, always see your PGs, which was kind of something that a lot of clans struggled to do when there wasn't as much plussing in the game at this point. So eventually, Conroe would be hit, and you couldn't play it as your first Vanguard anymore, just like Barcall. But that would come in January of 2014, and not for the reason you would think, but actually for the reason that there was a big bad deck in the meta at that point called Novel Vogue, and he increased the consistency of that deck tenfold. But that's for another story for another time. Other cards, we've already talked about Dragon Monk Goku, and of course there's Dragonic Overlord. He had quite a costly skill on him. He could use an axe skill, so you had to activate it during the main phase. Counterblast 3, he would gain 5,000 power, and then he would gain the skill as well as drive -1, which of course, a lot of the time he was on rearguard circles, so the drive part didn't really matter. He would gain 5,000 power, he'd be able to restand if an attack hit if his attack hit. So what you would do is you would swing into each of your opponent's front row units and restand him each time. It was effectively a front row board clear if your opponent couldn't guard it. So either it asks your opponent to drop a lot of shield, or they lose their front row. Either way, it's a win for you. However, Counterblast 3 was quite a bit. So that's why he's often played with Goku, which was a virtually free retire skill. Berserk Dragon was also one of the strongest Kagaguru units, as I've mentioned before. He was on place on Vanguard or Rearguard Circle to counterblast 2 and retire a grade 2 or lower. The fact that it could spot removal boosters was actually incredibly important later. It was just one of the best board control units at the time, and just a lot better than the Royal Paladin counterpart Blaster Blade. But yeah, so those are like your best units for Kagaguru from this set. We're going to continue on to Oracle Think Tank. One of the other major clans that was released in this set. CEO Amaterasu, as mentioned, was one of the more iconic Ultimate Blast units. And if you couldn't guess, she wasn't really utilized for her Ultimate Blast skill, but for her second skill that allowed you to look at the top card of the deck and put it on the top or bottom after soul charging. So, generally, you would get the soul charge, which allowed you to use it with Luckbird, a card that would come out in set 2. That allowed you to Soul Blast 2 and draw a card. So fueling that Luckbird was really nice from that Soul Charge, but also just top deck manipulation in general was really good. And that was kind of the theme of Oracle Think Tank at that time. Funny enough, her first continuous skill to gain 4,000 power when she attacked, as long as you had 4 cards in your hand or greater, was actually incredibly useful. If your drive checks got you to 4 or more hands in the middle of the battle phase, you would gain that 4,000 power during the battle phase, which sometimes players would misplay guarding against her, thinking, "Oh, I guard with this now; it's a 2 to pass." Then she gains the 4K power. Now it's a 1 to pass. So it's just sometimes it would lead to those kinds of missteps. So it was actually kind of useful. Also, hitting bigger numbers was always better during this time, when there wasn't a whole lot of power gain going around anyways. So Amaterasu, overall, very good card. Her ultimate blast skill was terrible. There's no way you were ever going to resolve it, because not only did you need all those resources, she also needed to hit in order to activate her skill. You got to draw 5 cards, but at that point in the game, how good is drawing 5 cards? And Amaterasu would, define her clan until Tsukiyomi would come out in set 3. Oracle Think Tank, despite these strengths, it had very little success during this time period. They had a few different useful cards, though, that were released during this time, such as Maiden of Libra, which was a card that would draw you a card when she hit for a Counterblast 2. That was that was kind of a standard at the time. Counterblast 2, get a +1, fairly common. And then Battle Sister Mocha, which was an 11k booster as long as you had 4 more cards. She could hit Vanguard without needing a booster, so that was fairly useful. Battle Sister Coco would essentially have the same check top card, put it on top or bottom skill that Amaterasu had, but it was blocked behind her on play skill. She was a 6k booster, so she was a otherwise useful supporter card that allowed you to continue to check the top card of the deck and hopefully ensure triggers. Overall, it was an okay wave of support, but Oracle Think Tank would get much, much better later on. So Nova Grappler was the redheaded stepchild of this set. Ashura Kaiser would be their boss unit. Not the best card in the world. He has a strong effect, but it's kind of inconsistent, and a lot of your deck seems to want you to build the deck around him, and it's just not the most consistent thing to build a deck around. He has 2 different skills. One states that if you don't have another Nova Grappler, he loses 2,000 power. You'd see this on a couple different cards. I think even Dragonic Overlord had this as well. It just said, if you're not mostly playing Nova Grapplers, this card's going to lose 2,000 power, which, fair, it has an 11k base. I think all of the 11k bases actually had that effect tacked onto them at the time, just to compensate for the fact that they were 11,000 power. But the other skill says that when he drive checks a grade 3 Nova Grappler specifically, you can choose one of your rear guards and stand it. So there's no power gain or anything like that. It's just supposed to compensate for the fact that you're drive checking a unit without shield. It gives you an extra attack. It's not the best thing in the world. They would get cards later to make it better, such as the Death Army cards from set 3. But even then, that just made the deck, it made the deck ceiling higher, but you're still struggling with the consistency of drive checking. Grade 3s being your deck's win condition. So not exactly terrific.
Nova Grappler would get some cool cards from the set that were really good, though. Brutal Jack was a key rear guard to restand with a Shurikaiser skill because he had an outstanding 11k base on a grade 2. So he had he had actually a few different skills, if I remember. He had an 11k base, but he had the restraint ability. And restraint was a very underutilized keyword that just didn't allow the unit to attack unless you met a condition. Generally, the second effect would allow you to release the restraint on that unit, if you will. A lot of them were kind of strange in that sense. For Brutal Jack specifically, you had to counterblast 1 during the main phase in order to release his restraint. So a little bit weird, and the restraint was on both Vanguard and Rearguard, so it was a really odd mechanic, and they only did it a few times, so I didn't feel like it was worth mentioning in the main mechanic section. But he also had a additional skill on Vanguard Circle that when he was boosted by a Nova Grappler unit, he would gain 5,000 power. This made him an incredibly good beat stick on Vanguard, but also on Rearguard Circle. Funny enough, later in Vanguard's history wasn't always a great idea to ride up to grade 3 for specific mechanics that we'll go into later. So he was actually an incredibly good grade 2 at that time to ride up into. The single counterblast every turn might sound like a lot, but unlike pretty much every other clan at that time, Nova Grappler had a plethora of countercharging options, even in set 1. These 3 main ones being Mr. Invincible, Hungry Dumpty, and best of all, Claydol Mechanic. Countercharge options for this clan became more and more useful over time as Nova Grappler obtained more powerful skills requiring counterblast. Claydol Mechanic, for instance, had a on-play skill that allowed you to countercharge 1. It was the easiest countercharge you possibly could ask for, and it was incredibly useful for multiple decks until we got better countercharge options. Funny to think that this was released in such an early set, though. Although at the time, Nova Grappler didn't really have a lot of cards that used Counterblast, so it kind of didn't make a lot of sense. Now, we've kind of talked about the 4 main clans that were released in set 1, so now we can kind of talk about what the best decks were during the summer of 2011. Now, the Nationals was basically dominated by 2 very specific clans, and that shouldn't shock you. It was Royal Paladins and Kagaguru, the 2 clans that got trial decks, the 2 clans that got the most support in set 1. It really shouldn't surprise you these were the best decks. Royal Paladin in particular would take not only first, but second and third place at both the senior and junior divisions of the National Championship. Royal Paladins would be mainly built around their 2 big bad boss units at the time, Kingdom Knights Alfred and Soul Saber Dragon. Alfred would act as your primary first ride as he gathered your troops and provided early pressure, and once you were set up for Soul Saber, you would ride it to close out games. Where we didn't have Soul Saber yet in set 1, a lot of the core components were already there. Barkall provided forward presence for a consistent grade 2 ride, and Alfred provided pressure and more rear guards. The consistency of pressure of this clan was unrivaled even in set 1, but would only improve further into set 2, although that will be a discussion for next time. Kagaguru didn't have the impressive results that Royals had at this time period. Most builds, though, were based around Dragonic Overlord for his costly but powerful skill, Berserk Dragon being one of the best board control skills in the game at that time, and Conroe for consistency. Interestingly enough, this was probably one of the more budget clans you could have played at the time, since a lot of its best cards came through a trial deck. And honestly, all of the other main core supporters were just double rares or lower, being Conroe and Bari. So that's probably why it actually had so much popular usage, despite being a otherwise not as good clan to Royal Paladins at that time. They would receive, even more support in set 2. But it still wasn't really enough to get them up to the same level as Alfred and Soul Saver at that time. So that kind of concludes what the best decks were. There's not really a whole lot to talk about. These two decks just utterly were the dominant decks of this Nationals. And there's not really a whole lot else to discuss in terms of what other top decks there were. You know, there's a few rogue decks I'm sure you could have figured out by how much I talked about Nova and Oracle Think Tank. These were cool decks. They just didn't perform as well as Kagaguru or Royals at this time. So that was Descent of the King of Knights. I hope I did a proper job explaining this set. It had plenty of quirks. It did a pretty good job to kick off our favorite game, though. And many iconic cards came from the set. Likely be very nostalgic for anybody who watched the anime back then. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Of course, leave suggestions. Let us know how we can improve these videos. I'm always up for criticism. And, if this is your first time seeing these cards before, you've never read them before, let us know what you think. Or if you played back then and you have any fond memories of these cards, let us know in the comments section. Until next time, I hope you guys can take care of yourself. Bye-bye.